Hello friends, in my previous lecture related to communication, I had explained you what is communication, which are the different types of communication and how we can have the effective communication by following the principles of communication. In this video, I will explain you what are the barriers to communication and how to overcome these barriers. The very first barrier to communication is linguistic barrier, that means barrier related to language. As we all know, language is most commonly employed tool of communication. But the fact that each major region has its own language is one of the barrier to effective communication. As the region changes, as the state changes, the language and the linguistic skills of individual also changes, and which creates the problem to have an effective communication. In case of organization, people from different culture, people from different background come together, and because of which the language there which they are going to speak, that may create the linguistic barriers, because they have different languages and they have different linguistic skills, and because of which communication channels that span across the organization would be affected. The next barrier to communication is psychological barrier. This is related to mental ability of sender and receiver. Now, many people have mental or psychological issues. For example, some may have the stage fear, because of which they are not able to deliver their speech properly, and which may pass the wrong message amongst the audience. Some may have speech disorders, some may be suffering through depression, some may have phobia, because of which the communication can be affected, and which may lead to barrier to communication amongst the sender and receiver. The next barrier to communication is emotional barrier. Now, every individual has got different EQ, that is emotional quotient. Now, in what situation we are, that is going to affect our communication. If we don't have control on our emotions, that means if we are angry, or if we are frustrated, or we cannot handle the humor, that would be reflected in our communication, and it might affect our decision making abilities also, and because of which that is going to limit the effectiveness of the communication which we are going to have with another person. So we should be able to handle our emotions properly so that we can effectively communicate with others. The next barrier to communication is physical barrier. This is the most obvious barrier generally we all face. Now, physical barriers may be in the form of noise, it may be in the form of big walls, closed doors, or the faulty equipment which we use for communication. In case of organization, the closed cabins or the large office which have physical separation between various employees may create the physical barrier to communication. Many times the equipments which we are using, the mobile phones or the computer systems or other technologies which we are using, that may create a physical barrier because of the faulty working. So that leads to physical barrier to communication. Next is cultural barrier. As we all know, the culture of each and every country is different. The dressing sense, the food which we have, uh, the way we dress up, the way we speak, the body language which we use, it changes as per our culture, and that leads to barrier to communication. As we know, we are heading toward, or we have already headed towards globalization and internationalization, and because of which people from different strata of society from different countries are coming together to work in an organization. But because of different cultural background, they are not able to communicate with each other properly or effectively, and that is a part of cultural barrier to communication. The next barrier to communication is organizational structure. Now, organizational structure is how or which methods are followed, whether we are following the upward communication, whether we are going to follow the downward communication, which channels are used formally, how we are communicating, what things are communicated informally. All these things are going to create the organizational structure barrier. How we are going to divide the people into different levels, as we all know that each organization has three different levels of management, that is top, middle and lower level management. So how these things are divided, how this organizational structure is maintained, depending upon that, it may create the organizational structure barrier to communication, because there might be lack of transparency, things may not be communicated properly. So again, that leads to organizational structure barrier. Next is sorry, attitude barrier. Now, depending upon the individual's nature or depending upon the individual's attitude, there might be some interruption in communication, or your communication may be ineffective. Now, some people are introverts, they are not very social, because of which they find difficult communicating with other, or they find difficult with going along with other, and which creates the barrier to communication, or which passes on the negative message. Many times your introvert nature is considered as your ego, or it is considered as inconsiderate behavior, so that leads to barrier to communication. Then many personality traits, as we know that many people are shy, many people are short tempered, they are not able to control their anger, many people are social, many people have social anxiety, and because of which all these things lead to attitude barriers, and your communication may become ineffective. Next barrier to communication is perception barrier. Very importantly, perception is how you view the similar thing. For example, the best example for this is half filled or half empty water glass. So, how you perceive the things, that is going to create a barrier to communication. Now, depending upon your background, the history you know about certain thing, or the knowledge which you possess, that is going to change your perception level. And depending upon your perception, you are going to communicate with your audience, or you are going to communicate with your sender, and that may create a barrier to communication, because your perception might be different from others, and that is going to pass on the wrong messages. So very importantly, clear messages and clear background must be given to the receiver. Next is physiological barrier. Now, physiological barrier is certain disorder or diseases, or the limitations which prevent from effective communication between the various channels of the organization. Now, as we can see, there are a few examples of physiological barriers. First is shrillness of voice, or many of them may have dyslexia problem, because of which your communication may become ineffective. So very importantly, we need to work upon our physiological barrier so that we can overcome this barrier. Next is technological and socio-religious barrier. As we know, the technology is changing every day. As we are heading toward globalization, internationalization, we need to cope up with the technological changes. For example, we are finding it easy to handle the internet, to handle the WhatsApp. We can easily communicate with the help of WhatsApp and many other things, Facebook, but it is not that easy for our grandparents to do the same. So that creates the technological limitations, or that may creates technological barriers to communication. So we have to cope up with the changing technology, and even the cost of technology is very high, leading to ineffective communication. So we have seen the barriers to the communication. Here are some of the ways through which we can overcome the barriers. The very first is clarify ideas before communication. Very importantly, the one who is going to send the message, he or she should be very clear about the things that are to be communicated. he or she should have complete knowledge about the things which are to be communicated to the audience or to the receiver, so that you can clearly send the ideas or clearly send the message to the receiver. Second way to overcome barrier is to communicate according to the need of the receiver. Now, very importantly, we need to understand the situation or the receiver. We need to understand his IQ or EQ level, what background he has got, what knowledge he has about the previous thing that has happened, and depending upon all that thing, you should communicate depending upon the need of the receiver. The next way to overcome the barrier is to consult other before communication. Now we should understand whether the receiver is in condition to get your message or not. So before starting with the communication, you should consult the audience or you should consult the receiver and then start communicating with him or her. Next is ensure proper feedback. In my previous video, I had explained you the communication steps, how a communication takes place, what is the process of communication. In that, very important component is feedback. Unless you get the feedback from the receiver, the communication won't be completed. So very importantly, the receiver has to give the proper feedback so that the communication becomes effective. If there is no feedback from the receiver's end, communication won't be completed and you cannot say that it was an effective communication. Next is consistency of message. Very importantly, whatever messages you are going to pass, whatever things you are going to pass, that should be in consistency with the rules and regulations that are being followed, or that should be consistent with the previous things or the previous messages which you have passed on. If not, then it creates the barrier to communication, because that are going to contradict with the rules and regulation which is laid down in the organization or the things which we have earlier communicated. So that should be with in consistence with the previous thing. Next is proper use of body language. Now this generally happens when you are going to have one-on-one interaction or when you are going to address the group. So very importantly, whatever you are communicating orally, that should match with your body language. Otherwise, you are standing in front of people, and if you are continuously shivering or if you are continuously biting your nails, that would pass on the negative message amongst the people. And at the same time, you should have proper eye contact, your body language should be proper, you should have proper gestures, posture. So all this is going to pass on the positive message and going to make your communication effectively, and that is going to support your oral communication. Very importantly, you should work upon your communication skills. If you have complete knowledge about certain things, but if you don't have strong communication skills, that may create a barrier to communication, because you are not able to execute the things properly because of the lack of communication skills. And very importantly, avoid slangs and jargons. See, now what happens, many times we use the terms which are difficult for others to understand. For example, if we are explaining some medical terms to a student from engineering background or from commerce background, that won't be easily understood by these students. Vice versa, if some commerce terms are explained to the medical student, it won't be understood by these students because they don't have any background. So these are the jargons or slangs are the wrong words, or like without thinking, if you are making a statements, that may create the barrier to communication. So very importantly, you should avoid using slangs and jargons to make your communication effective. So in this video, I had explained you what are the barriers to effective communication, and we have seen how we can overcome these barriers. Thank you.